The Captain's Gift by Sylvester Scoe-Foreux. Part 1. The Rhythm of the Bay. The sun hadn't yet broken the horizon when Jack Hartley's weathered hands untied the last mooring line from the dock. At 80 years old, his fingers still moved with the precision of a man who'd spent decades in cockpits and another decade on the water. The early morning air carried the salt-sweet smell of Mobile Bay, and somewhere in the darkness, a heron called out its lonely greeting. "You remember to grab the extra ice?" Frank Webb asked, stepping carefully into their 24-foot fishing boat. At 53, Frank moved with the deliberate caution of a man whose body had already logged too many hours of hard work, 40 hours a week maintaining city parks for Mobile, and another 20 or 30 on the water with Jack. "In the cooler, right where it always is," Jack said, his voice carrying the gravel of age and cigarettes he'd quit 20 years ago. "You worry too much, Frank. One of us has to." But Frank was smiling as he said it, settling into his usual spot at the bow. This was their ritual. Friday evening after Frank clocked out, all day Saturday and Sunday, and Monday, Frank's day off. 4 days a week, on Mobile Bay, fishing for whatever was running, selling their catch to Lee Chandler at Lee's seafood market near the boat ramp. It wasn't glamorous work. Some weeks they barely cleared enough to cover gas and bait after Lee took his cut. But out here, with the water turning from black to gray to gold as the sun rose, neither man had to think about bills or politics or the way the world seemed to be spinning faster and meaner with each passing year. "Sarah ask about the electric bill again?" Jack asked as he guided them out of the marina. Frank nodded, not meeting his friend's eyes. "It's up another $30 this month, and gas." He didn't finish the sentence. They both knew. The price at the pump had climbed so high that Frank had started calculating whether each trip was worth the fuel. "We'll have a good day," Jack said firmly. "I can feel it. You always say that. And I'm right about half the time. That's better odds than the lottery." Frank laughed despite himself. This was what he came for, not just the fish, but the easy companionship, the jokes that weren't particularly funny but somehow always landed right. Jack had a way of making the weight feel lighter, even when his own burdens were heavy enough. The old man lived on his Air Force pension and VA disability from wounds he'd taken in Vietnam, wounds he never talked about, though Frank had seen the scars that spiderwebbed across his back one hot afternoon when Jack had stripped off his shirt. They were brothers, really. Not by blood, but by choice and time and the 1,000 small kindnesses that accumulate between two men who've seen each other at their worst and decided to stay anyway. The sun broke free of the horizon as they reached their spot at Middle Bay Homeport, painting the water in shades of amber and rose. Jack cut the engine, and the sudden silence was profound, just the lap of water against the hull and the distant cry of gulls. "Heaven must look something like this," Frank said quietly. Jack nodded, already baiting his line. "If it doesn't, I'm asking for a refund." They fished in comfortable silence for a while, the way old friends do. Frank thought about his daughter's college applications, about his son's braces that insurance wouldn't fully cover, about Sarah's tired eyes when she looked at their bank statement. He thought about how much longer he could keep this up, the double life of city worker and fisherman, the exhaustion that had become his constant companion. But then his line jerked, and the familiar thrill shot through him, and for a moment nothing else mattered except the fight between him and whatever was on the other end. "That's a good one," Jack called out, already reaching for the net. By mid-morning, they'd pulled in a respectable haul redfish, speckled trout, a few flounder. Enough to make the trip worthwhile. Enough to justify coming back tomorrow. That's when Frank saw it. "Jack, look there." He pointed toward a disturbance in the water about 50 yards out. Something white was thrashing, struggling. Jack squinted, then reached for the binoculars he kept in the console. "It's a bird. Pelican, I think." White pelican. He lowered the binoculars, his jaw set in that way. Frank recognized the look that meant Jack had made a decision, and nothing would change his mind. "Let's help the poor thing. Jack, we've got a good spot here." "Won't take but a minute." Jack was already starting the engine. Frank knew better than to argue. Besides, he felt it too, that pull towards something suffering, the instinct to help even when it wasn't convenient or practical, maybe especially then. As they drew closer, the situation became clear. A magnificent white pelican was fighting to keep its head above water, its wings beating frantically but achieving nothing. Something was dragging it down. "Easy now," Jack murmured, cutting the engine and letting them drift closer. "Easy, bird. We're here to help." The pelican's eye fixed on them, wild, terrified, exhausted. Frank grabbed the long-handled net they used for landing big fish. "Careful," Jack warned. "That bill can do damage." But the bird seemed to understand. Or maybe it was just too tired to fight anymore. Frank scooped it up in one smooth motion, and together they hauled it into the boat. Up close, the pelican was enormous, easily 4 feet long, with a wingspan that would have stretched wider than the boat. Its white plumage was matted and dirty, and now they could see the problem. A fishing hook had embedded itself deep in the bird's bill, and attached to it was a heavy lead sinker that had been pulling the pelican under with every attempt to dive or even hold its head up. "Poor thing's probably been like this for a day or more," Jack said softly. "Couldn't eat, couldn't rest, just fighting to breathe. How do we get the hook out without hurting him worse? Same way we'd do it for ourselves, hold him steady." Frank wrapped his arms around the pelican's body, pinning its wings gently but firmly. The bird's heart hammered against his chest like a drum. "I've got him." Jack's hands, steady despite his age, worked the hook carefully. The pelican made a low, mournful sound but didn't struggle. Maybe it knew. Maybe it understood that these rough hands were trying to help. Almost. There. Jack gave one final careful twist, and the hook came free. He held it up, a big circle hook, with a 2-ounce sinker still attached. Some fool using gear too heavy for what he's fishing. This thing would have killed him eventually. Frank loosened his grip, and the pelican shifted, but didn't try to escape. It just sat there in the bottom of the boat, breathing hard, its bill opening and closing. Jack reached into the cooler and pulled out 2 mullet from their bait supply. "Here you go, friend. You've earned these." He tossed the fish to the pelican, who caught them with surprising speed and swallowed them whole. Some life seemed to return to the bird's eyes. Then Jack did something that made Frank's throat tighten. The old man leaned forward and gently kissed the top of the pelican's head, right between its eyes. "You're going to be okay now," Jack whispered. "You're going to be just fine." Together, they lifted the pelican and set it back in the water. For a moment, the bird just floated there, as if testing whether it could still swim. Then, it paddled a few feet away, stopped, and turned back to look at them. Frank felt something shift in that moment, something he couldn't name but could feel in his bones. The pelican's dark eye held theirs for a long moment, and then it dipped its head once, almost like a nod, before swimming away. "Well," Jack said, settling back into his seat. "That was something." Yeah," Frank agreed. "That was something." They didn't catch much else that day, but neither of them minded. On the way back to the dock, as the sun began its descent toward the western shore, Frank found himself looking back toward where they'd released the pelican, though it was long gone from sight. "Think he'll make it?" he asked. Jack smiled. "I think that bird's a survivor, just like us." Part 2. The Daily Visitor. The pelican came back the next morning. Frank spotted at first a white shape gliding low over the water, heading straight for their boat. "Jack, is that—" "I'll be damned," Jack breathed. "It's him. I know it's him." The pelican circled once, then landed in the water about 10 feet from their boat. It looked at them expectantly, its bill opening and closing. "He's hungry," Frank said, already reaching for the bait bucket. "Hold on." Jack pulled out a mullet and held it up. "Come on, friend. Come get your breakfast." The pelican paddled closer, cautious but determined. When it was within range, Jack tossed the fish. The pelican caught it midair. "I think we just made a friend," Frank said, grinning. "I think we did." They named him Captain Jax. from his Air Force days when he'd flown with a pilot who had the same dignified bearing and sharp eyes. Every morning after that, Captain appeared at almost exactly the same time, just after they'd set their lines. Every morning, they fed him mullet or whatever small fish they'd caught. And every morning, the pelican would stay for a while, floating nearby, as if keeping them company. "You know we're cutting into our profits feeding him like this," Frank said one Saturday, though he was already pulling out Captain's breakfast. "Some things are worth more than money," Jack replied. Over the weeks, Captain became part of their routine. As essential as checking the weather or baiting the hooks, they found themselves looking forward to his arrival, found themselves worried on the rare mornings when he was late. Jack started bringing his camera, taking pictures of the pelican that he'd print out at the drugstore and show to anyone who'd listen. "That's my friend Captain," he'd say proudly. "Smartest bird on Mobile Bay." Frank's son, David, asked about the pelican one night at dinner. "Dad says you guys have a pet pelican now?" "Not a pet," Frank corrected. "A friend. There's a difference." Sarah smiled at that, reaching over to squeeze her husband's hand. She understood. She'd seen how the fishing trips had changed from a financial necessity to something more a lifeline, a source of joy in a world that offered precious little of it. But joy, Frank was learning, was expensive. Part 3. When the water turns dark. The first sign of trouble came at the gas pump. Frank stood watching the numbers spin upward, his stomach sinking with each click. When the pump finally stopped, he'd spent $75 to fill the boat's tank, nearly double what it had cost 6 months ago. He did the math in his head on the drive home. 4 trips a week, roughly 1 tank per week. $300 a month just for gas, not counting bait, ice, equipment repairs. And their catch had been down lately, the fish weren't running as well, or maybe there were just more fishermen competing for the same waters. Last month, after Lee took his cut and they split the remainder, Frank had cleared maybe $400, barely enough to cover the gas, let alone justify the time. Sarah was waiting up when he got home, sitting at the kitchen table with their bills spread out in front of her like a losing hand of cards. "We need to talk," she said quietly. They talked until past midnight. The electric bill, the water bill, the car insurance that had gone up again, David's braces, Jennifer's college applications, and the looming reality of tuition. The roof that was starting to leak in the corner of their bedroom. "Maybe I could pick up some weekend work," Frank said. "Johnson's been asking if I want to do some landscaping jobs on the side." "That's your fishing time." "I know." Sarah reached across the table and took his hand. "I'm not asking you to give it up. I know what it means to you, what Jack means to you. I'm just saying, we need to figure something out." Frank nodded, unable to speak past the lump in his throat. The next morning, he told Jack about the conversation. They were sitting in the boat, lines in the water, Captain floating contentedly nearby after his breakfast. "I might need to cut back," Frank said. "Maybe just Mondays for a while. Pick up some extra work on the weekends." Jack was quiet for a long moment. "I could help with the gas money." "Jack, no, you're already—" "I'm already, what? Old? Retired? I've got my pension, my VA check. What am I saving it for? Your own bills, your own life." "This is my life, Frank. This boat, this bay, you and that damn bird. This is what I'm saving it for." But Frank knew Jack's finances were tighter than the old man let on. He'd seen the way Jack bought the cheapest bait, the way he patched his fishing vest instead of replacing it, the way he made a single sandwich last all day. "We'll figure it out," Frank said, though he had no idea how. Then the storms came. Part 4. The long wait. Hurricane season hit Mobile Bay with a vengeance that year. Not a direct hit, they were spared that mercy, but a series of tropical storms and their remnants that churned the Gulf into a gray, angry beast and made fishing impossible for weeks at a time. Frank went to work, came home, helped with homework, paid bills that kept climbing. He picked up weekend landscaping jobs that left his back aching and his hands blistered. He stopped checking the weather obsessively because it was always the same. Small craft advisory, high winds, dangerous seas. He worried about Jack, alone in his small cabin by the water. He worried about Captain, out there somewhere in the storms. He worried about everything, the way a man does when he's watching his dreams slip away like water through his fingers. 3 weeks into the storms, Jack called. "Just checking in," the old man said, his voice smaller than Frank had ever heard it. "Wanted to make sure you and Sarah and the kids are doing okay." "We're fine, Jack. How about you?" "Oh, keeping busy, watching the weather, waiting." They were both quiet for a moment, listening to the static on the line and the unspoken truth between them. They might not be able to keep doing this. The boat, the fishing, the friendship that had been built on early mornings and shared silence, it might all be ending. "I miss it," Jack said finally. "I miss the bay. I miss Captain. I miss... hell. I miss everything about it." "Me too," Frank said. "Me too." When the weather finally broke, they made plans to go out on the next Monday. Frank called in sick to work the first time he'd done that in 5 years. He needed this. They both did. The bay was calm that morning, almost unnaturally so, as if apologizing for its recent violence. The sun rose clear and bright, and for a moment, everything felt like it might be okay. But Captain didn't come. They waited at their usual spot, lines in the water, but neither man really fishing. They were watching the sky, scanning the water, looking for that familiar white shape. "Maybe he found a better spot," Frank offered. "Better fishermen who feed him bigger mullet." "Maybe." But Jack's voice was hollow. An hour passed, then 2. The sun climbed higher, and the day grew hot. And still no Captain. "Frank," Jack said finally, "I need to tell you something." "What's that?" "I've been thinking, maybe it's time. Time to sell the boat. Time to admit we had a good run, but it's over." Frank felt something crack inside his chest. "Jack." "No, listen. You've got your family to think about. I've got my memories. That's enough. That's more than a lot of men get. We saved that bird. We had our time on the water. We were friends. That's a good story. That's enough." "It's not enough," Frank said fiercely. "It's not nearly enough. Sometimes enough has to be enough." They sat in silence, the weight of endings pressing down on them. Frank thought about all the mornings they'd never have, all the sunrises they'd miss, all the easy companionship that would fade into occasional phone calls, and then Christmas cards, and then nothing at all. He thought about Captain, wherever he was, and hoped the bird was okay, hoped he'd found someone else to feed him, to care about him. He thought about how unfair it all was that money and gas prices and the simple arithmetic of survival could take away something that mattered so much. "I'm sorry," Jack said quietly. "I'm sorry I can't." A cry split the air above them. They both looked up at the same moment. A white pelican was diving toward them, wings tucked, moving fast, too fast. "Captain!" Frank shouted. The bird was coming straight at the boat like a missile. At the last possible second, its bill opened and something fell out, glinting in the sunlight. Then Captain pulled up hard, wings spreading wide, and soared back up into the sky. The object hit the bottom of the boat with a metallic clank and slid under the bait bucket. Frank and Jack stared at each other, then scrambled for the bucket. Jack got there first, his old hands shaking as he reached underneath and pulled out. "What is it?" Frank asked, though he could already see. "Something gold, something ornate, something impossible." Jack held it up to the light. It was a necklace, heavy, intricate, with links that had been crafted by hand centuries ago. The gold caught the sun and threw it back in warm, honeyed light. "You won't believe it," Jack whispered, his eyes wide as saucers. "You won't believe it, but this is real Spanish gold." They looked up. Captain was circling overhead, calling out in that distinctive pelican voice, as if to say, "Did you get it? Did you understand?" "Spanish gold," Frank repeated, the words not quite making sense. "How—" "The hurricane," Jack said, his mind already racing. "The storms. They must have uncovered something, shifted the sand, exposed a wreck. And Captain—" He looked up at the bird with something like awe. "Captain found it. But why would he bring it to us?" Jack smiled, and there were tears in his eyes. "Because we saved him. Because we fed him. Because that's what friends do. They save each other." Captain called out again, then turned and flew off toward the east, toward a part of the bay they rarely fished. "He wants us to follow him," Frank said. Jack was already starting the engine. "Then let's go see what our friend wants to show us." Part 5. The Secret of the Cove. They followed Captain for 20 minutes, the pelican staying just ahead of them, circling back whenever they fell too far behind. He led them away from the main channels, away from the popular fishing spots, into a part of Mobile Bay that Frank had never explored, a maze of small islands and shallow water that would be treacherous for anyone who didn't know the way. Finally, Captain descended and landed in a small, isolated cove. The water here was crystal clear and shallow, maybe 8 feet at its deepest, and there, resting on the sandy bottom like a sleeping giant, was a shipwreck. "My God," Jack breathed. It was a Spanish galleon, or what remained of one. The wooden hull had long since rotted away, but the skeleton of the ship was still visible, ribs of timber jutting up from the sand, the outline of the deck, the suggestion of what had once been masts. And scattered across the bottom, glinting in the clear water, were coins, hundreds of them, maybe thousands. "The hurricane must have uncovered it," Frank said, his voice barely above a whisper. "All that churning. All those storms, they moved enough sand to expose it." "And Captain found it," Jack added. "He's been diving here, feeding. He must have seen it, and somehow," he shook his head, "somehow he knew to bring us here." And they anchored the boat and just stared for a long moment. The wreck was beautiful, in its way a piece of history, a tragedy, a treasure. Frank thought about the men who'd sailed on that ship, who'd died when it went down. He thought about the families who'd waited for them to come home, who'd never known what happened. "We can't tell anyone," Jack said suddenly. "Not yet. Maybe not ever." "Jack, think about it, Frank. The moment word gets out, this place will be swarmed. Treasure hunters, the state, the federal government, they'll take it all, and we'll be lucky to get a finder's fee. But if we're careful, if we're smart, we could change our lives," Frank finished. They looked at each other, and an understanding passed between them. This was their secret, their miracle, their chance. "We'll need to be careful," Jack said. "Take a little at a time. Never enough to raise suspicion. Tell people we're testing a new fishing spot." "What about Captain?" As if in answer, the pelican landed on the bow of their boat and looked at them with those dark, knowing eyes. "I think Captain will keep our secret," Jack said softly. "Won't you, friend?" The pelican dipped its head, and Frank could have sworn it was a nod. Part 6. The Careful Harvest. Over the next 2 months, they developed a routine. They'd fish their usual spots in the morning, making sure to be seen, to catch enough to sell to Lee. Then they'd make their way to the cove, always checking to make sure no one was following, and spend an hour or 2 diving. The water was shallow enough that they didn't need scuba gear, just masks and snorkels. They'd take turns diving down, filling a mesh bag with coins and small artifacts, never taking too much at once. They hid their finds in a false-bottom jack built into one of the boat's storage compartments. Captain came every morning, like clockwork. They fed him his mullet, and he'd fly off toward the cove, as if standing guard. Sometimes, when they were diving, Frank would surface to find the pelican floating nearby, watching over them. "He's protecting us," Jack said one day. "Or protecting the treasure. Maybe both." They researched Spanish shipwrecks at the Mobile Public Library, careful not to seem too interested, not to ask too many questions. They learned about the Spanish treasure fleet that had sailed these waters in the 1700s, about the storms that had claimed so many ships, about the fortunes that still lay buried beneath the Gulf's waters. The coins they were finding dated to 1,733 pieces of 8 doubloons silver reals, Each one was worth hundreds of dollars, sometimes thousands, depending on condition and rarity. They found jewelry, 2 rings, necklaces, religious medals. They found a silver chalice that made Jack weep when he held it, thinking about the priest who'd carried it, who'd probably died clutching it as the ship went down. They took everything to a coin dealer in Pensacola far enough from Mobile that no one would connect them to any local discoveries. The dealer, a sharp-eyed man named Morrison, asked no questions and paid in cash. He probably suspected the coins weren't entirely legally obtained, but he didn't care. That was the thing about treasure, it made everyone a little bit crooked. After the first month, Frank paid off his credit cards. After the second, he made a large payment on his mortgage, telling Sarah it was a bonus from the city. She looked at him skeptically but didn't push. She knew her husband, knew he'd never do anything truly wrong. If he said it was a bonus, then it was a bonus. Jack was more cautious with his share. He paid off his cabin, set aside money for medical expenses, and started making anonymous donations to the local VA hospital. He bought a new fishing vest, finally, and a better camera to take pictures of Captain. They were careful. They were smart. They were getting away with it. And then Vernon Talbot started asking questions. Part 7. The Bully's Interest. Vernon Talbot owned the biggest marina in Mobile Bay and 3 seafood restaurants that catered to tourists. He drove a BMW, wore expensive sunglasses, and had the kind of tan that came from leisure, not labor. He'd made his money the old-fashioned way he'd inherited it, and he never let anyone forget it. He'd always looked down on Jack and Frank, the way rich men look down on those who work with their hands. He'd made jokes about their old boat, their patched equipment, their modest catches. Once, he'd offered to buy Jack's boat for half what it was worth, just to see the old man's face when he refused. So when Vernon started noticing that Jack and Frank were spending a lot of time in the isolated cove, his interest was piqued. And when he noticed they seemed happier, more relaxed, less desperate, well, that was downright suspicious. "Heard you boys found a new fishing spot," Vernon said one afternoon when they were selling their catch to Lee. He'd wandered over from his restaurant next door, drink in hand, smile sharp as a knife. "Just testing some new waters," Jack said evenly. "Must be good waters. You've been going there a lot." "It's peaceful," Frank offered. "Not many people know about it. Maybe I should check it out. Always looking for new spots for my charter boats." "It's pretty shallow," Jack said. "Not really suitable for charters. Lots of sandbars. Easy to run aground if you don't know what you're doing." Vernon's smile widened. "Well, I guess I'll just have to be careful then." After he left, Lee shook his head. "That man's got a nose for money like a shark's got a nose for blood. Whatever you boys are up to, you better be careful." "We're not up to anything," Frank said. "Sure you're not," but Lee was smiling. "Just remember, some secrets are worth keeping, and some secrets will eat you alive. Make sure you know which kind you've got." That night, Frank couldn't sleep. He kept thinking about Vernon's smile, about the way the man had looked at them like a cat that had spotted a mouse hole and was willing to wait. "We should stop," he told Jack the next morning. "We've got enough. We should stop before." "Before what?" Jack asked. "Before we secure your kid's future? Before we make sure Sarah never has to worry about bills again? Before we do some actual good with this money? Before we get caught." "We won't get caught. We've been careful." But 2 days later, Frank saw Vernon's boat near the cove. He was with 2 other men, and they had diving equipment. "He knows," Frank said, "or he suspects. Either way, we're done." Jack's jaw tightened. "We're not done. We're just going to have to be smarter." But how do you outsmart a man with money and connections and time to spare? How do you protect a secret when someone powerful wants to take it from you? The answer came from an unexpected source. Part 8. The Guardian. They were at the cove 3 days later, making what they'd decided would be their last dive, when Vernon's boat appeared at the entrance to the cove. He had 4 men with him this time, all wearing diving gear, all looking eager and greedy. "Well, well," Vernon called out across the water. "Looks like we found your secret fishing spot, boys." Frank felt his stomach drop. This was it. It was over, but Jack just smiled. It's a free bay, Vernon. Fish wherever you like. Oh, I don't think we're here for fish. Vernon's grin was predatory. I think we're here for the same thing you've been pulling up for the past 2 months. And I think, legally speaking, anything we find belongs to whoever finds it. Finders keepers, right? That's not how maritime law works, Jack said calmly. Maybe not. But I've got lawyers who can argue it either way. How about you? You got lawyers, Jack? The other men were already preparing to dive. Vernon was still smiling, already counting his fortune. And then Captain appeared. The pelican came in low and fast, calling out in a voice that sounded almost like a war cry. He dove straight at Vernon's boat, pulling up at the last second, his wings beating so close to Vernon's face that the man stumbled backward. What the hell? Captain circled and came back, even more aggressive this time. The other men ducked as the pelican swooped over them, his bill snapping, his wings creating a wind that rocked the boat. "It's just a bird," Vernon shouted. "Ignore it!" But Captain wasn't just a bird. He was a force of nature, a white fury, a guardian protecting what was his. He dove again and again, targeting anyone who tried to put on diving gear, anyone who moved toward the water. His calls echoed across the cove, and suddenly there were other pelicans appearing, brown pelicans, joining their white cousin, all of them diving and swooping and creating chaos. One of Vernon's men took a wing to the face and fell backward into the boat. Another dropped his diving mask overboard in his haste to protect his head. Vernon himself was crouched in the captain's chair, arms over his head, shouting curses that were lost in the cacophony of pelican cries. "Let's go," one of the men yelled. "This is crazy. Let's get out of here." Vernon tried to argue, but another pelican, or maybe it was Captain again, it was hard to tell in the chaos dove so close that he could feel the wind from its wings. "Fine, fine. We're leaving." His boat roared to life and sped out of the cove, the pelicans pursuing them for 100 yards before finally breaking off and returning. Frank and Jack sat in stunned silence as the birds dispersed, until only Captain remained, floating calmly in the water beside their boat as if nothing had happened. "Did that really just happen?" Frank asked. Jack was laughing deep, genuine laughter that shook his whole body. "That really just happened. Our friend just saved us." Captain paddled closer, and Jack reached into the cooler for the biggest mullet they had. "You earned this, buddy. You earned all of it." The pelican took the fish gently from Jack's hand, and for a moment, the old man and the bird just looked at each other. Frank saw tears on Jack's weathered cheeks. "Thank you," Jack whispered. "Thank you, friend." Part 9. What treasure really means. They didn't go back to the cove after that. They'd taken enough, more than enough. They'd been given a gift, and they'd been given a warning, and they were smart enough to know the difference. Vernon tried to file a complaint with the Coast Guard about the dangerous bird in the cove, but without being able to explain why he'd been there in the first place, the complaint went nowhere. He tried to hire his own divers to search the area, but word got around about the pelican attack, and no one wanted the job. Eventually, he gave up, though he never stopped looking at Jack and Frank with suspicious eyes. But by then, it didn't matter. The treasure was hidden, the secret was safe, and the two fishermen had everything they needed. Frank sat down with Sarah one evening and told her everything. He expected anger, maybe fear, but instead she just listened, her hand in his, until he'd finished the whole story. "So we're rich?" she asked, finally. "We're comfortable," Frank corrected. "We're secure. The kids' college is paid for. The house is paid for. We've got enough saved that we don't have to worry anymore." "And the pelican did this?" "The pelican led us to it. But Jack and we earned it, Sarah. We saved that bird's life, and he saved ours right back. That's not luck. That's not stealing. I don't know what it is, but it feels right." Sarah was quiet for a long moment, then she smiled. "I always knew there was something special about you and Jack. I just didn't know it was this special." Jack used his share differently. He established the Captain's Fund, a small foundation dedicated to marine wildlife rescue and rehabilitation, with a special focus on pelicans. He donated anonymously to the VA hospital, to homeless veterans, to the families of men he'd served with who hadn't made it home. He bought a new boat, nothing fancy, just something reliable, and he and Frank kept fishing. Not because they had to anymore, but because they wanted to. Because the bay was still beautiful, and the sunrises were still worth seeing, and their friendship was still the best thing either of them had. And every morning, Captain came to visit. Part 10. The Gift That Keeps Giving. 5 years later, Frank stood on the deck of the Mobile Bay Marine Wildlife Center, watching as a group of school children learned about pelican conservation. The center had been Jack's idea, a way to use the treasure for something that mattered, something that would last. They'd never told anyone about the Spanish gold. As far as the world knew, Jack had received a large inheritance from a distant relative, and he'd chosen to invest it in conservation. Frank had been lucky enough to be hired as the center's director, a job that paid well and let him spend his days on the water he loved. Jack was 85 now, moving slower but still sharp as ever. He came to the center every day, giving tours, telling stories, taking pictures of the pelicans that had been rescued and rehabilitated, and Captain still came to visit. The pelican was older, too, his feathers not quite as bright, his movements not quite as quick, but every morning, he'd fly to the center's dock, and Jack would be there with a bucket of mullet, and they'd spend a few minutes together, old friends sharing a secret that no one else would ever fully understand. "You think he knows?" Frank asked one morning, watching Jack feed the pelican. "You think he understands what he gave us?" "I think he knows exactly what he gave us," Jack said. "And I think we gave him something, too. We gave him his life back. Everything else, the gold, the treasure, all of it, that's just details. The real gift was the friendship. That's what saved us both." Frank thought about that. He thought about the man he'd been 5 years ago, exhausted, desperate, watching his dreams slip away. He thought about the man he was now secure, purposeful, able to provide for his family and do work that mattered. "We should have named the center after him," Frank said. "Captain Center. It has a nice ring to it." "He doesn't need his name on a building," Jack said. "He's got something better. He's got us." Captain finished his breakfast and paddled out into the bay, but he didn't fly away immediately. Instead, he turned back, as he always did, and looked at them with those dark, knowing eyes. Jack raised his hand in a small wave. "See you tomorrow, friend." The pelican dipped his head that gesture that looked so much like a nod, and then spread his wings and took flight, white against the blue sky, beautiful and free. "You know what the funny thing is?" Jack said, watching the bird disappear into the distance. "We spent all that time looking for treasure, trying to make ends meet, worrying about money. And the whole time, the real treasure was right there. It was the bay and the fishing and the friendship. The gold just helped us see it. The gold helped us keep it," Frank corrected. "There's a difference. Maybe. Or maybe we would have found a way regardless. Maybe the treasure was just the universe's way of saying we'd earned it. That we'd done something right." They stood in comfortable silence, watching the water, listening to the sounds of the center behind them, children laughing, pelicans calling, the gentle lap of waves against the dock. "Jack?" Frank said finally. "Yeah?" "Thank you for everything, for the fishing, for the friendship, for believing we could do this, for saving that bird." Jack smiled, and his eyes were bright with tears. "Thank you for being there to save him with me. Thank you for being the kind of man who stops to help a struggling bird even when you've got your own struggles. That's who you are, Frank. That's who you've always been. That's who we both are." "Yeah," Jack agreed. "I guess it is." The sun climbed higher, painting the bay in shades of gold and amber. Somewhere out there, Captain was fishing, diving, living the life they'd given back to him. And here, on the dock, two old friends stood together, rich in all the ways that mattered. They never told anyone about the Spanish galleon. They never revealed where the treasure had come from. Some secrets, they'd learned, were worth keeping not because they were shameful, but because they were sacred. The treasure had changed their lives, yes. It had given them security and purpose and the ability to do good in the world. But the real miracle wasn't the gold. The real miracle was a white pelican who'd remembered kindness and repaid it 1,000-fold. The real miracle was friendship that transcended species, that turned a simple act of compassion into something that would echo through generations. The real miracle was learning that sometimes, when you save a life, you save your own. And that, Frank thought as he watched another group of children arrive for their tour, was a treasure beyond price. Epilogue. The last visit. Jack Hartley died on a Tuesday morning in early spring, 3 weeks after his 87th birthday. He went peacefully, in his sleep, in the cabin by the water where he'd spent his happiest years. Frank was the one who found him, coming by for their usual morning coffee before heading to the center. Jack looked peaceful, a small smile on his weathered face, as if he'd died dreaming of something beautiful. The funeral was small, just family, a few friends from the center, some old Air Force buddies who'd made the trip. They buried him in the Veterans Cemetery with full military honors, and Frank stood at attention as they folded the flag, remembering the young pilot Jack had been, the warrior, the friend. But the real memorial happened 3 days later, at dawn, on Mobile Bay. Frank took the boat out alone, carrying a small urn with some of Jack's ashes. He went to their old spot at Middle Bay Homeport, where they'd fished together for so many years, where they'd saved a struggling pelican and changed both their lives forever. He scattered the ashes on the water, watching them drift and dissolve, becoming part of the bay Jack had loved so much. He said a prayer, not a formal one, just words from the heart, about friendship and grace and the gifts we give each other without even knowing. And then he waited. The sun rose, painting the water gold. A heron called from the shore. The bay was peaceful, beautiful, eternal. And then, from the east, a white pelican appeared. Captain was old now, Frank could see it in the way he flew, the effort it took to stay aloft. But he came anyway, gliding low over the water, circling the boat once, twice, 3 times. Frank stood up, tears streaming down his face. "He's gone, Captain. Jack's gone." The pelican landed in the water beside the boat, in the exact spot where Jack used to sit. He looked up at Frank with those dark eyes, and Frank could have sworn he saw understanding there. Grief, even. "He loved you," Frank said. "He loved you so much. You saved us, you know. You saved both of us." Captain dipped his head, that gesture that looked so much like a nod. Then he spread his wings and took flight, circling higher and higher, until he was just a white speck against the blue sky. Frank watched until he couldn't see the pelican anymore. Then he sat down in the boat, in his old spot, and let himself cry for Jack, for the years they'd had, for the friendship that had meant everything. He never saw Captain again after that day. The pelican stopped coming to the center, stopped appearing at the old fishing spots. Frank liked to think that Captain had known, somehow, that his work was done, that he'd repaid his debt and then some, and now he could rest. Or maybe, and this was what Frank chose to believe, maybe Captain had gone to find Jack, wherever old friends go when their time on Earth is done. Maybe they were together again, on some eternal bay where the fishing was always good and the sunrises never ended. Frank kept running the center, kept telling Jack stories, kept feeding the pelicans that came to the dock each morning. He never remarried after Sarah passed, never moved away from Mobile Bay. This was his home, his purpose, his life. And sometimes,